It's called Apocalyptic Visions of Peace, and it's because apocalypse means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So start with just these three images, and I think they're pretty interesting. So if you look, like, what do these images make you feel when you see them, just in the abstract, if possible?
Unsafe.
Unsafe. Yeah.
Strange.
Yeah. Yes.
Beast, what happened to Islam after they murdered Ali in 661 and Hussein in 680?
Yeah, so quite specific as far as the apocalyptic. Yeah. Well, so like you see, like these especially you see in these apocalyptic sort of scenarios. Like apocalyptic literature is something that's existed since at least 200-300 BC, and it's very cosmic in scope. It often has like a lot of symbolism in it, and it's sort of extreme, honestly. And it's done that way on purpose to convey a message. It's not necessarily literal. Is something we'll come to get into. But the thing about them is that they imply, they imply story. And so each one of these things is a little scary, a little unsettling by itself. But by itself, it's not a story. It's just a thing. But when you kind of put all these things together, that's kind of like the combined imagery you often get when you're dealing with apocalyptic literature. And together, it really does kind of imply a story. It implies, it's almost like there's the idea of the end of something, but then this is almost like overkill. Like you don't need the stars falling on Earth if there's beasts devouring everybody. Like there's too many things going wrong at the same time. So it must be in some sense symbolizing something else. So my thesis in this 20-minute talk, which is a little ambitious, is that the Abrahamic religions specifically tell history as a drama, with apocalyptic as the pivot point, like between the chapters. It's kind of like the last couple paragraphs at the end of a chapter, and then it's kind of transitioning to the next chapter. So the writings of the Bahá'í Faith, but I guess like specifically here, the Universal House of Justice's promise of world peace, invite us to see our own age as such a turning point. And that's kind of the claim I'm making. It's kind of vague. Anyway, so what do we mean by apocalyptic, right? So in religious studies, apocalyptic refers to a way of interpreting history in light of an imminent, divinely orchestrated transformation. Now, all those words are really important, but we don't have time to get into them. So classic academic definitions describe apocalyptic as a genre of revelation in which the hidden realities are unveiled. The word apocalypsos in Greek means like an unveiling, actually, like you're seeing something in the future. It's not necessarily, it doesn't imply the end of something. It's this unveiling. So both the spiritual order of the cosmos and sort of the destiny of history. But like through visions, symbols, and sometimes angelic mediators, you see this quite often, especially in the more ancient sources. So at its heart, apocalyptic thought says that present turmoil isn't random, but it's part of something bigger. It's part of a divine plan. And it leads, and there's judgment kind of in that, but also renewal, and most importantly, the vindication of what God has said. So quite often, when God says something, it doesn't come true immediately. It's kind of something that he's putting out there. But then there's this expectation that over time it will come true, and sometimes in quite dramatic kind of circumstances. Right, so the imagery varies. Like you've got Jewish prophecies of God's kingdom and many, many more things. Christian visions of the new creation, you get like the book of Revelation, and elsewhere, with Jesus quite a little bit as well in the Olivet Discourse. Okay, Islamic teachings on the day of resurrection, and I'll argue the Baha'i view of humanity's collective coming of age. It has a lot of these same apocalyptic elements. But the theme is that history is moving towards this decisive turning point. And this is kind of, in a certain sense, it always is. So it doesn't matter what chapter of a book we're in. At the end of that chapter, it's moving towards something. So it could be our own chapter. It could be the chapter, in a Baha'i sense, 2 manifestations of God from now. Who knows, right? But there is that sort of that theme. So in short, apocalyptic doesn't just mean the end of the world. It means the end of an old order and the dawn of a new one. It's not the end of the world. It's the end of your world, right?
My world.
Yeah.
Like Taylor, Chelseanism at the end of Planet of the Apes.
Yeah, something like that. So basically going through like 4 kind of things here. So the Jewish and Christian hopes, which I honestly shouldn't have melded together, but I did. This thing kind of came as a slide that was pre-made, and 4, 5 things, 4 holes. So Islamic transitions, Baha'i developments, and then talking a bit about the promised world peace itself. So first, like I just want to go through, and this is more of like a narrative thing. I'm not really going into depth on anything specifically. But in the Old Testament, right, you have a bunch of different points that are actually just inside of that one large book. There are different kind of apocalyptic turning points. So you have Exodus, when God overthrows oppressive powers, in this case Egypt, and creates a new people, like from Abraham's people, and then gives them a new home, right? But that's, if you look what Moses had to do in ancient Egypt against the Pharaoh, all the plagues and everything else, those are quite apocalyptic in scope, like in the real essence of that word, even in popular culture. Later on, when they have the law, but the thing with the law that God gives them is that there's a blessing and a curse. And so in Deuteronomy 28, basically God says, listen, if you do what I ask you to do, Israel, as a nation, I will bless you and I'll make things really nice for you. But that's like a fourth of that chapter. The other 3/4 are like, this is what will happen if you don't do these things. And like, holy crap. Like if you ever just want to feel better about your own situation and about the way that God's dealing with the world, just read Deuteronomy 28. Like Slim's back there, because we were talking about it devotional the other night. But I could just the very end is like basically saying, like, things will be so bad if you don't follow what I say, that like you want to sell yourselves into slavery and no one will buy you. That's the most brutal thing I've heard in quite a long time. So yeah, don't cross God. Judgment will come and there'll be an apocalypse. So like next you have the exile to Babylon. The destruction of Jerusalem is told as a judgment, and it really happens, right? And the prophets envisioning after that eventual restoration. But that's the end of that world, for ancient Israel. And then they go to Babylon and they come back, it's different. It's never actually quite the same. And that leads up to actually the advent of Christianity as well. You've got this messianic hope, which is kind of looking forward after the exile. It's these images of a coming king, renewed creation, in quite cosmic terms, right? Like there'll be a new world, right? There'll be a new heaven, a new earth. So it's this longing for God's decisive intervention. You've got Daniel. Daniel is pretty trippy if you've ever read it. It's like there's all these visions of beasts and what they mean and what empires they symbolize. But it's definitely kind of saying that God is not just in control of you spiritually, he's in control of history. And so all these like huge invasions and these big planet moving things that are happening in history, they're not random, and God's really in control and it's moving towards something good, even though it seems quite out of control and violent and dangerous at present. And so for Israel, right, the big takeaway, Israel, like apocalyptic wasn't abstract. It's how they told their own story of crisis and hope. Right, and get a couple examples. This is a quick one from Isaiah. For I'm about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. And then in Daniel, it says, there shall be a time of anguish, such as never has occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So quite binary, quite sorting people out, but very, very cosmic. In the New Testament, it's a little different, but you still have these different points. So you have John the Baptist, he announces Isaiah, he quotes Isaiah, saying that these things that had been said are fulfilled. The idea of the valleys being lifted, mountains made low, God's salvation revealed to everyone on earth at that time, which Jesus had like just come on the scene. But John the Baptist is saying that everybody on earth had seen him. And like it had been explained to anybody, like everybody has a spiritual sense, which is quite interesting, right? It's very kind of apocalyptic sounding in a certain sense. Okay, Jesus's mission, he preaches the kingdom at Israel's apocalyptic moment, right before they rebel against Rome. And then literally ancient Judaism ended in the year 70, when Rome came in after the rebellion, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and ancient Judaism revolved around the temple itself. The temple is where God was supposed to reside. If there is no temple, and a lot of the Old Testament is like the different regulations about how to worship God in the temple, they have to find a completely new way of being Jewish. And so the Judaism that exists now is Judaism, obviously, but it's a really different expression of it, trying to figure out how to deal with the loss of the temple, right? So that world was destroyed, right? And Jesus is looking forward to that. You have Paul. Paul says Jesus' death and resurrection is the big turning point. It's the judgment on Israel, but it's renewing Israel in the form of Jesus that people can join. And it's good news to the nations, because now non-Jewish people can become part of the inner circle. They can become part of the people of God. And that's a huge change for the world, in some sense, kind of apocalyptic, the end of the Jewish world, the end of the old pagan world. And then Rome is transformed. The gospel spreads across the empire, and it reshapes the world's spiritual state. Paganism was everywhere. Paganism was the default religion. Within 300, 400 years, paganism was gone everywhere. Pretty earth-shattering, pretty crazy. So the takeaway is, for Christians, apocalyptic frame their crisis as a dawn of God's new age in a very large sense. So you have John the Baptist here, like I was saying. It says, basically, Isaiah is fulfilled. Prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. So all flesh shall see the salvation of God. So if you're ever talking to Christians who are very, interested in prophecies being literally fulfilled, this is one that was fulfilled at the time of Jesus. But it's not literal, right? But it's still true. So just interesting to, think about. Jesus says in Mark 1:15, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. And it's funny because that's the first thing that I think Jesus says in the entire Bible, at least in Mark anyway. So what is the good news at that point? Actually, it hasn't even been explained yet, but something's changing. So Islam, the Quran picks up that thread. It's that you're part of the same story. Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and now Muhammad, right? It's apocalyptic horizon, this last day, judgment, vindication of the oppressed, which is a big theme, right? Unity. Islam, like Christianity, retells history through an apocalyptic lens, a world out of balance that's being set right by God's intervention into history. And for Muslims, this apocalyptic frame is the assurance that history has a moral arc and that will culminate in God's justice. Because you'll find in the Quran, it's like God's speaking to the people through the people are worried that it's justice will be denied, that the right things, that God's justice won't come through. And so they're being reassured. And so a couple of surahs here, a couple of little quotes that are, I feel like, quite illustrative of this. So man asks, when is the day of resurrection? Then when the eyes are dazzled, the moon is eclipsed, and the sun and the moon are brought together, that day man will say, where is the escape? Nay, but there shall be no refuge. Unto your Lord that day is the dwelling place. So there's a judgment coming, and the world is going to change. Right? So Muslims often think about this as like the end of days, but it's also just as true when Muhammad was saying it to the world at that time. Like it's a judgment on that world. And then similarly, in the Surah 82, it says, when the sun is enfolded, what does that even mean? When the stars fade away, when the mountains are set in motion, when the pregnant camels are abandoned, which is really specific and interesting. There's another one that's kind of depressing and specific. When the wild beasts are gathered, when the seas have been made to swell over, when the souls are coupled, and when the female infant buried alive is asked for what sin she was slain. When the pages are spread, and when the heavens lay bare, when hellfire is kindled, and when the garden is brought nigh, each soul shall know what it has made ready. Right? And so in Bahá'í developments, right, Baha'u'llah teaches that history is progressive revelation. Humans are moving through different stages of development. That over the centuries, over the millennia, there's an arc that we're aiming towards. Apocalyptic is reframed, not as collapse, but disintegration of old structures alongside, building up of new ones, going on at the same time, right? In the Promise of World Peace, the letter, it tells a global story, which is humanity moving from small groups to big groups, and then the challenges that we're encountering in this last transition, right? So our apocalypse as Baha'is is the birth pangs of unified world order. But it's no less real and maybe even scarier for that. In the Kitab-i-Aqdas, Baha'u'llah says, the world's equilibrium hath been upset through the vibrating influence of this most great, this new world order. Mankind's ordered life hath been revolutionized through the agency of this unique, this wondrous system, the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed. So things are changing in the biggest of ways. And this is also in the letter itself, but Baha'u'llah says, the winds of despair are alas blowing from every direction, and the strife that divideth and afflicteth the human race is daily increasing. The signs of impending convulsions and chaos can now be discerned, inasmuch as the prevailing order, so everything, appeareth to be lamentably defective. And then, so trying to locate the promise of world peace, at least as being apocalyptic, at least in some sense, right? Apocalyptic, I would say, is the hinge of the narrative in the end of the document. Each Abrahamic tradition has its own way of kind of explaining these things. Today, the Baha'i story is that our crisis is global, but so is our hope. And again, though the Promise of World Peace has lots of different genres and elements of different genres in it, I think at its core, it's a work of apocalyptic. But it doesn't have such heavy symbology, I'll say that. So a few different kind of verses that kind of illustrate that. It says, whether peace is to be reached only after unimaginable horrors, precipitated by humanity stubbornly clinging to old patterns of behavior, or is to be embraced now as an act of consultative will, is the choice before all who inhabit the earth. At this critical juncture, when the intractable problems confronting nations have been fused into one common concern for the whole world, failure to stem the tide of conflict and disorder would be unconscionably irresponsible. So again, those scales, those are cosmic scales, it feels like. It has that quote from Baha'u'llah earlier, and then it continues on. Flaws in the prevailing order are conspicuous, such as the inability of the United Nations to exercise the specter of war, the threatened collapse of the international economic order, the spread of anarchy and terrorism, and the intense suffering which these and other afflictions are causing to increase in millions. And that was 40 years ago. I was born the year before that, so that also dates me. But it seems just as true now in different ways, maybe more true. Here it says, the Baha'i Faith regards the current world confusion and calamitous condition in human affairs as a natural phase in an organic process, leading ultimately and irresistibly to the unification of the human race in a single social order whose boundaries are those of the planet. Which, as a Baha'i, when you read these enough, like you're just like, yeah, this is just what Baha'is believe. This is just this is what the House of Justice says, and they say it in different ways, other letters. But like, if you come at this from not a Baha'i background, like I did, also a long time ago, like this is crazy. Like, this is such a huge scope. Like, people don't say things like this. People don't talk like this. But it's, in some sense, like only a divinely inspired message could actually reach these kind of boundaries, I think, in its scope. So Shoghi Effendi, I think this has been quoted a couple of times, but I think it's just good to focus on its apocalyptic sense, right? If long cherished ideals and time-honored institutions, if certain social assumptions and religious formulae have ceased to promote the welfare of the generality of mankind, if they no longer minister to the needs of continually evolving humanity, let them be swept away and relegated to the limbo of obsolescent and forgotten doctrines. Like, in some sense, that's the bedrock of our society to a large extent. And swept away, forgotten. Right. And so when you think about apocalyptic as well, apocalyptic, like I was saying, is about unveiling something. It's about showing the future. These are some of the things that the Promise of World Peace kind of talks about as being in the future. Like, if you weren't a Baha'i, you would say, this is them predicting these things. As Baha'is, we say this is them saying these things are going to happen, right? But you have very wide scale things. Universal acceptance of the oneness of humanity, right? A reconstruction and demilitarization of the world. It's not a small thing. Nations cede the right to wage war, impose taxation beyond agreed limits, and maintain large armaments. Creation of a world superstate, right, with the 3 branches of government. Oh man, the numbering didn't work on the next one. Recognition of the interdependence of capital and labor. That's not so radical. It's ambitious, but not crazy radical. Replacement of religious fundamentalism with mutual respect, which sounds nice, but that's actually super hard. Let me tell you, somebody who works in like comparative theology and interfaith stuff, man. Eradication of racial prejudice and establishment of world citizenship. Like, what would world citizenship even be, man? Anyway, establishment and enforcement of international law, highest loyalty to humanity, not nations. And that's even a hard one, I think, for us. Maybe some people have an easier time than me. Because you're watching international football, right? You have your team, right? And it means a lot. You don't want certain other teams to beat you. And nationalism comes up a little bit. And there are other things as well. As an American, I'm not immune to these things. So transferring your loyalty, the highest loyalty to humanity, and then down below that nation state, maybe down below that something more local. That's actually a reordering of the natural way that humans, the presumed natural way that humans are. Usually it's local, then something higher, then nation, then maybe humans as a whole, right? So you're turning that upside down, which is quite apocalyptic. And this is all preceded by an all-embracing world treaty, which Abdul Baha talks about and the Promise of World Peace talks about. There'll be a sacred document, at least for us as Baha'is. And that's kind of like, we're kind of like, okay, Revelation is sort of ended. We have guidance from the House of Justice. But Abdul Baha said, when the nations get together and they create like a constitution or whatever it'll be, we have to treat that as a sacred document, which I guess I read this a long time ago when I became a Baha'i, when I was reading through this, but I'd forgotten about it. And I was like, that's very, very interesting. All right. And so kind of summarizing here at the very end. So the Promise of World Peace declares the old world of division marked by war, racism, sectarianism, and economic extremes is passing away. In its place, a new order is being revealed. One humanity united in justice, equality, and collective security. Nations will yield absolute sovereignty to a world federation. Women and men will share full partnership. Universal education will spread world citizenship. And a single auxiliary language will bind the peoples of the earth. This is not just the end of war, but the dawning of the most great peace, the birth of a new world and fulfillment of humanity's destiny. I mean, I feel like that's one of the most apocalyptic things that you can possibly say. And that's what the promise of world peace, I think, is. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Caleb, for grabbing the apocalyptic bull by the horns and taking us straight down that road. That was fantastic and very, very interesting. Do we have questions from our audience?
Yeah, I think maybe also interesting. I loved your presentation. Thank you very much. I think it may also be interesting to consider the writings of the Bab, because when the Bab came, there was sort of this expectation of apocalyptic moment that would be marred by violence. So there's a belief that the promised time would come and the streets would run with blood. And also you have that concept with the Christian rapture, this belief that the future just holds violence. But it's very interesting that the Bab chose, on the night that he began his revelation, to write a commentary on the story of Joseph. And Joseph really is a much beloved sacred figure in Islam, Christianity, Judaism. And Joseph represents the opposite of violence. Joseph represents forgiveness, reconciliation, beauty, and peace. He's a peaceful prophet. So in a way, and then he kind of reinterpreted the entire Quran in the key of Joseph. This new understanding, this new vision that the future is going to be not a future marked by violence, but by different ethos.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I know that the surah of Joseph, like the story of Joseph, is the only kind of story in the Quran that has a beginning and an end, and it follows it all the way through. So it is interesting, like the centrality in some sense of Joseph. Yeah, very, very interesting.
So the predominant view, it seems now, with the pre-Bahá'í religions is the kind of the violence and destructive view of these apocalyptic narratives rather than the renewal narratives. But presumably there are minority groups in each of those faiths that do have that view of renewal rather than just everything gets destroyed. Do you have a perception throughout your work or just people you've met and everything of how small that minority is, and also why the broader communities seem to focus on the destructive version rather than the renewal version, historically or even in modern times?
It's funny because, like, as far as different groups and religions that have a more renewal mindset when it comes to apocalyptic, I haven't seen that very much. I mean, it seems like you either have camps of people who take apocalypse very literally and very seriously, or you have people, like, at least in Christianity, as far as I know, Judaism and Islam as well, like, either you take it really seriously in a literal way, or you just kind of try to ignore it as much as possible, or maybe play it down. It's just symbolic of something, and you don't go into what. I'm sure there's some people out there that have like a more kind of iterative renewal version of that, but actually I haven't come across it, to be honest. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Yes, yes, sir.
Really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. I think just listening to your different definitions of apocalyptic made me think that, in a way, looking at the course of the history, that the earth has been so unequal, like resources, opportunity, the lens through which we view the world has been so distorted and uniquely distributed that, in a way, a global meritocracy would be truly apocalyptic, in that sense, right? Like, in the same way that if, like, private for generations here in England, people who are privately educated are disproportionately likely to be in leadership positions, right? So for them, like a more meritocratic system would be apocalyptic in a way, right? Like, I just was wondering if you had any thoughts on the kind of the global lens of that kind of that view of apocalypse, right? Like, who are we speaking to when we say apocalypse. Does that make sense?
Kind of. I mean, like when you're talking like in a world sense, like today, apocalypse. I mean, you're saying like kind of what the writings say. It's that like these old institutions that we have that kind of are the foundation on which we walk. They're the water in which we swim. We don't even notice them most of the time. Like to the extent that those are no longer really fit for purpose, like we're gonna feel it when those things really crumble. And when it comes to like this interesting example, like meritocracy being like a universal thing. I mean, you could say that like in the 1990s, like when globalization happened, and then capital and labor was allowed to flow across borders, it was hugely disruptive. Sometimes maybe unfairly, sometimes it was like, it caused more destruction than it was worth, depending on how you talk about it. But when instead you're like having to compete with everybody that is at your best at your job in the world. And I think in a different way, when we look at the dating market, right? Before it's like you were in a village, you knew everybody in the village. And so you kind of like, people kind of paired up accordingly, right? But now it's like you're competing with everybody in the world. And it's like, and people aren't getting together, right? I mean, like people are holding out for somebody better, right? I mean, there's a lot of unfair statistics and stuff, but it's like if you're like a woman in the UK and you're 28, right? And this is gonna sound really brutal, but like you're only 50% likely to ever have kids at that point. And just like there's basically it's a huge crisis dating. So it's just like, but that's been the destruction of that sort of the low-key local dating market, and then replaced with something that's just out of control. Right. So I think you're going to see stuff like that, but on a global scale and in ways that we haven't really figured out yet. So to end on a happy note.